Hello, welcome. My name is Chelsea Lake. I work on the events team at Politics and Bookstore. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore, where we now host in person as well as we still host virtual events, partnered events, trips, and classes. For a full listing, you can visit our website at politics-prose.com. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones. There is a mask mandate in the store in accordance with the transmission level of the area. So if you don't have a mask, we have plenty that you can have. When the floor is opened to audience questions, you'll line up here at this pillar and use the microphone. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing here at this table. So if you have not already purchased a book, we have plenty of books behind the register at the front of the store. So now, without further ado, this afternoon I'm very excited to announce and introduce Funny Business and to welcome Michael Mill and Evan Thomas to Politics and Prose. Drawing on Buchwald's most memorable columns and unpublished correspondence with other famous people, Funny Business shows how Art Buchwald became an American original. Like Mark Twain, Dorothy Parker, and James Thurber, he satirized political scoundrels, lampooned the powerful, and worshipped the quicksand that 10 presidents walked on, as Buchwald joked. The key to Buchwald's style of humor, he once stated, was to treat light subjects seriously and serious subjects lightly. Michael Mill is a historical researcher who has assisted acclaimed authors including David McCullough, Jon Meacham, Senator John McCain, and Michael Beschloss. He won an Emmy Award for his work as a co-producer on Ken Burns' PBS series, The Civil War, and served as a historical consultant on HBO's miniseries, John Adams. A graduate of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, Hill also served as a press assistant to former Vice President Walter F. Mondale. Hill will be in conversation this afternoon with Evan Thomas, the author of 10 books, including the New York Times bestsellers John Paul Jones, Sea of Thunder, and First, Sandra Day O'Connor. Thomas was a writer, correspondent, and editor for 33 years at Time and Newsweek, including 10 years as Washington bureau chief at Newsweek, where, at the time of his retirement in 2010, he was editor at large. Thomas has taught writing and journalism at Harvard and Princeton, where from 2007 to 2014, he was Ferris Professor of Journalism. He's currently at work on a book about the end of World War II to be published by Random House in 2023. In addition to our esteemed guests, Michael Mill and Evan Thomas, we're very pleased to have Art Buchwald's son and daughter-in-law, Tamara. They've graciously agreed to stick around for a few minutes after the event if you have any questions. Thank you very much for being here. So without further ado, I turn it over to you two. Thanks.
Thank you. We're delighted to be back at Politics and Prose. Is this the greatest bookstore there ever was? Yes. And delighted to be with my old friend, Mike Hill. We go back many, many years. So let's just jump right in. Mike, talk to us. Where did he come? Where did Art Buchwald, where did this amazing Art Buchwald come from?
Well, Evan, before I get into that, first of all, I want to thank you for being here. I'm very grateful. I've known Evan for decades. I've had the pleasure to help him do some research, and his wife, Osi, research on several of their books, and it's been a great pleasure. So I'm thrilled that you're here today. The Art Buchwald story, in a nutshell, before I started working on Funny Business, I had this sense that Art Buchwald, I was a huge fan of his in college and read his pieces and just loved his humor, as my parents did and so forth. But I had this view that Art Buchwald was this fun-loving, brilliant satirist and comic columnist who, through spontaneous combustion, just appeared on the face of the earth and started making people laugh and laugh at themselves. And then, of course, as soon as I started digging into the story, I saw that there was a much more complicated, much more American story of a guy who, through determination, overcame a lot of difficult personal background issues from his very beginning. As a child, he spent time in a number of foster homes in and around New York City. Difficult time with that. He was a high school dropout, enlisted in the Marine Corps during World War II, had some difficult times there. But then after the war, he decided to stay on the West Coast, and with some hopes of becoming a comedy writer or a Hollywood screenwriter, and took some courses at USC. But then in the spring of 1948, he struck gold and found out that through the GI Bill, he could spend time studying in Paris. So he took off, went to Paris, didn't know anybody, couldn't speak any French, and then with dreams of becoming a writer, a novelist, writing the great American novel, or a journalist. He spent some time as a stringer for Variety magazine, and then he decided that, incredibly, a guy who had very little journalistic experience, no college degree, high school dropout, no Ivy League degree, decided he was going to work for the greatest newspaper in the world, the New York Herald Tribune. So one day he walked into the Paris bureau and walked up to one of the editors and with typical Buchwald chutzpah said, I'd like to write a entertainment cafe review column for the Herald Tribune. The editor gave him the once-over, looked at him, and he said, we don't have any interest in a column like that, and if we did, you wouldn't be the one to write it, so get the hell out of here. And but again, with typical Buchwald chutzpah, what he did was that he waited until that editor went on vacation, went back to the bureau, found another editor, proposed the same thing, and the editor said, well, if you're going to do reviews of cafes and that, it might bring in some revenue, restaurants advertising in the paper, so sure, why don't you take a whack at it? And initially, his writing was not very good. And the editors just thought it was a little bit clumsy. But he was worried that he was going to get fired. So what he did was, typical resourceful Art Buchwald, was that he decided, well, I'm going to start writing funny stuff, humor in my columns. And he did, and the editors at that point saw something wonderful in his ability to do humor and in his columns. So within a matter of years, the editors gave him a couple more columns to write about American celebrities visiting or traveling through Paris. And within several years, he became a journalistic celebrity on both sides of the Atlantic. And then he started to mingle and get to know all of these wonderful celebrities, some of whom became longtime friends. He played chess with Humphrey Bogart. Lauren Bacall became a lifelong friend. Irwin Shaw, the novelist who wrote Rich Man, Poor Man, became a lifelong friend. Ben Bradley, that's where their friendship began. Frank Sinatra he hung out with. And in 1959, he got a exclusive interview with PFC Elvis Presley, who was stationed in the Army over there. So he spent the next 14 years in Paris, and both Art and his wife Anne, who he met in Paris and married there, said that those 14 years were the greatest years that they ever spent. But then in 1960, when JFK was elected president, he felt he was getting a little bit stale just writing about his exploits in Paris and Americans living and coming through Paris. And he saw the new frontier as a possibility for new material, particularly satirical material, political satirical material. So he thought about moving back to Washington to do his column from there. But several of his friends said, look, you got a great gig here. Why disrupt things and go to Washington where you're going to be writing about ego-driven politicians. And they said, if you do it, you're going to get massacred. And plus, how could you possibly compete with columnists like Walter Lippmann, the Alsop brothers, or Arthur Kroc? But to his wonderful, great credit, he decided to take the plunge, came in 1962, and within a couple of years, he was a national, worldwide journalistic celebrity with his humor and his satire, and eventually was syndicated in 500 newspapers in 100 countries around the world, and became, to my mind, one of the greatest political humorists and satirists that America's ever produced.
So where does this? You said a couple of things. That where does the chutzpah come from, and where does the humor come from?
Well, the humor, I think, comes from, and he writes about this wonderfully in his memoir, is that he says that because of going to a number of foster homes and the bleakness of his life all about him, he said he determined and figured out that the one way to get people to like him was through humor and to become the class clown. And so at one point he says, he writes in his memoir about his life, "This stinks, I'm going to become a humorist." And lo and behold, it all came true. The chutzpah, I think comes from, because he was a foster child and because he was on his own so much in those early years, that he developed a very, very independent spirit and a determination that he was going to succeed despite the odds against him. As a matter of fact, there was one thing in the Buchwald papers, which are now on deposit at the Library of Congress, which thanks so much to Tamara and Joel for preserving all of that collection. I couldn't have done this book without them or without the papers.
How many boxes of papers?
I know there's 100,000 items covering his entire career, all the way back to his childhood. And one thing I found was that because he was a foster child, that caseworkers would have to go visit him and report on how things were going with him. And in one of the reports, I think he was 11 or maybe 12, that one of the caseworkers said, Art Buchwald is very independent and he refuses to be taken advantage of. And I think a lot of that independent spirit and so forth, and drove him to want to succeed.
He must have been. To think of this kind of roly-poly, not an orphan, but a kid who bounced around a lot, poor kid, hanging out with Lauren Bacall in cafes. Help us.
Well, I think my sense is that this guy, Art Buchwald, and his wife Ann too, were such a joy to hang out with that I think to myself, what a gas it must have been to sit down. There's a wonderful photograph in the book of Art with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall sitting at a restaurant. And I thought to myself, what a gas it must have been to sit with this guy and with the constant one-liners and jokes and so forth. And so I think one explanation is the fact that he was such a joy to be with, that people liked being hanging. Instead of talking about serious business, why not talk about funny business? And I think that was a lot of it. The other, and I think, Joel, you mentioned this to me one time, was that because he became this celebrity doing this column about all these American celebrities in Europe and Paris and so forth, that after a while he became the man to see, and a lot of these PR agents for these celebrities coming through thought, if we can hook him up with Art Buchwald, he'll do something in his column about you.
He talk a little bit, if you would, about his humor, because he's a satirist. He's making fun of people, and yet people like him.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes if you're a satirist, people hate you. So.
Yeah, I think the difference. A couple of things on that. I think the difference is, and I noticed this early on, and I've heard some other people tell me that the difference between Art Buchwald's humor and satire was that he could be sharp, he could be tough, but he was never mean-spirited. And I think that's a huge difference between some of the satirists now. That he was never mean-spirited. He was tough. The other two that I think he talked about in this interview in 1969 which, again, this was at the tail end of the 60s, which was a very difficult, tumultuous, tragic decade, that he said that he was asked about his satire and that, and he said, you know, we're living in some very difficult, uptight times, meaning the 60s at that point. And he said that if I can help take off a little bit of the steam of what we're going through and make people laugh and laugh at themselves and that, I'm doing something good for my country. And I often think that if he were with us today, he would feel, particularly in our times of this, of our kind of bizarre state of politics and you know, uptight aspects of part of our society, that he would feel a sense of obligation to write good, sharp satire, but also to let people take off a little steam, to make them laugh and also laugh at themselves.
But let's go back to, so he arrives in Washington 1962?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So paint a picture for us of the Washington he came to and how he fit in and how he made a place for himself.
Yeah, well, again, you know, going back to part of the draw for him was that he saw this glamorous, stylish Kennedy family coming to the White House after the Eisenhower years, and I think he saw them as a wonderful opportunity to write some new material. Also, the other thing too that he recognized was the fact that JFK had a really good sense of humor, and that he would appreciate. And as a matter of fact, there's a quote in the book that JFK once said to him, and JFK had a very difficult relationship with the Herald Tribune. As a matter of fact, at one point he canceled the White House subscription to it because he was so upset with the Herald Tribune. But he once said to Art Buchwald, he said, "The only reason I read the Herald Tribune anymore is because of your column." And so he came back to that world, and Ben Bradley was back here by this time, working with Newsweek. But then he became part of the Kennedy world, although he always saw he needed to keep a line in between that he could be friends with them and so forth, but that he had an obligation, you know, as a journalist and a columnist, to maintain his own set of integrity. And he would write some humorous columns about the Kennedys, and they might freeze him out for a little bit, but then, unlike today, the friendships would resume and things would go on.
But that's not an easy thing, to be befriending the kind of first family of Washington and all that.
Right.
Make fun of them, and yet still get along with them. I mean, break that down a little bit. What did the various Kennedys think of him? How did they regard him? How did he regard them? And how did he walk that tight wire?
Yeah, I think, well, President Kennedy, again, he didn't know a lot, but you know, Kennedy appreciated his humor because Kennedy had a good sense of humor. When it came to Robert Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy, they as I understand it, that they became closer friends. Although Robert Kennedy, at times, if Buchwald, you know, poked him in one of his columns, he would respond to that. There's two great stories that I remember. One was that after Art Buchwald wrote something about Bobby Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy came up to him and said, "How many people take you seriously?" And when Art Buchwald said, "Oh, about 50%," Kennedy said, "Well, then why don't you knock it off?" And then the other story is that I think it was after he wrote a piece about Bobby Kennedy and the New York subway strike, and Bobby Kennedy didn't take too kindly to it. And after that, he was at he was at a party at Hickory Hill, and at one point, Bobby Kennedy from across the room said, "I just want you to know, Ethel invited you. I didn't invite you." But he became very, very close friends with Ethel after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. As a matter of fact, Bobby Kennedy Jr. wrote that Art Buchwald was one of Ethel's closest friends, and then he became, I think, quite close with Teddy Kennedy. And as a matter of fact, in the book, there's a beautiful letter that Teddy and Vicki Kennedy wrote to Art Buchwald when he was ill, just telling him how much he loved him.
So, of course, there are other power centers in Washington. Talk to us a little bit about how he got along with J. Edgar Hoover and LBJ and, some other big dogs.
Great. Well, he, with J. Edgar Hoover, he saw him as a wealth of satire, and he was always writing some column jamming him. And as a matter of fact, one of my favorite columns is one that he wrote in 1964, and it was titled, J. Edgar Hoover Just Doesn't Exist. And at this time, of course, J. Edgar Hoover was not only one of the most well-known people in America, if not the world, but one of the most feared men in the country. So he writes this piece saying J. Edgar Hoover doesn't exist, saying that he was a mythical character first thought up by Reader's Digest magazine, saying that the name Hoover came from the vacuum cleaner. It gets better. To give the idea of a cleanup of crime in America, Edgar came from the name of the nephew of one of the publishers, and Jay, of course, came from jail. So this column goes out, and incredibly, people across the country started to think it might actually be true. I mean, there's incredible stories. I found these news articles where everywhere around the country that newspaper editors everywhere were being deluged with calls or letters to the editor demanding that Art Buchwald be fired or that his column be terminated. And it was just, and this went on for weeks. Anytime he went anywhere, he was asked about this. Now, J. Edgar Hoover never said anything publicly about that column, but what we do know is that he kept a column, or it kept a file on Art Buchwald, that every time he did some column about the FBI or Hoover or whatever, he'd get a copy of it, and then he would write a memo, and on these memos he would write, this is a sick alleged humorist, this is a sick comic, and then one point, in total exasperation, this sick alleged humorist is at it again. And then, so not only was Art under surveillance by J. Edgar Hoover for his columns, but then LBJ, during the mid-'60s when things were not going well for LBJ, and particularly in the war in Vietnam, Art wrote a whole series of columns. He wrote one column at one point in '66 saying that maybe he should send Batman and Robin to Vietnam to try and help out, which prompted this wonderful letter from Adam West, who, if you remember, played Batman. It's in the book. It's a wonderful letter that Adam West wrote. And the final paragraph, he says, if President Johnson comes after you with his axe, please rest assured that Robin and I will hop in our super bat plane and come to your rescue in multi Technicolor. But then there was another column that Art wrote about Johnson's handling of the war, and some humorless White House aide triggered a National Security Agency surveillance of Art Buchwald, which was never disclosed until about, I think, several years after he passed away by the National Security Agency here in Washington, D.C. So just to review the bidding, so if the object of a political satirist is to get under the skins of powerful people in Washington, D.C., then Art Buchwald won the gold medal for satire because he was under surveillance by J. Edgar Hoover and the National Security Agency at the same time. And that's pretty good for a satirist.
But he was unafraid.
He was absolutely unafraid. And another thing I found that was interesting was that when he was still in Paris in the mid-1950s, when McCarthyism was still going on, and people everywhere were terrified of Joe McCarthy, not only politicians, but also newspapers about saying anything, that Art wrote a really wickedly funny piece making fun of Joe McCarthy. And his editors were, of course, terrified of McCarthy. They killed the piece. And so what did Art Buchwald do? he took it and sold it to the New Republic, and it was published there. And the other example of him not afraid of anybody was, of course, when he took on Hollywood and Paramount, when they took an idea. Yeah, he had written a proposal for a film, and it was shopped around Hollywood, and there was some initial interest in the proposal to make it as a film, and then it was killed. And then he had the option of taking it to another studio, so he did, and there was a possibility it was going to be made there. Then he finds out that Paramount is going to do a film with Eddie Murphy with a very, very strangely similar concept. And Art Buchwald, of course, was furious. He was absolutely furious. So he decided that he was going to sue Paramount, and he got this wonderful lawyer, Pierce O'Donnell, from your Edward Bennett Williams book. Yeah. And got Pierce O'Donnell. Everybody told Art Buchwald and Pierce O'Donnell, you're never going to, forget it. It's not going to happen. They pursued it. The lawsuit went on for, I believe, 7 years. And it was just a horrible, horrible thing. The Paramount lawyers tried to destroy Art's reputation on the stand, but he never gave up. And eventually, they settled for much less than they probably should have had. But it was this case where, again, going back to that childhood report that the caseworker, that he refused to be taken advantage of. And I think he saw it was not only that, but it was a matter of honor to him that somebody had taken his idea, and he wanted credit.
I was also struck, as I recall, Marvin Davis, who was the head of Paramount.
Martin Davis, yeah.
Sort of gave him the back of his hand, didn't take it seriously.
That's right.
Art, pat you on the head, you'll go away. No.
That's right. And he didn't, yes, and he didn't. And again, it was one of these things that, as you said, is Martin Davis thought, you're kidding. You would never do this. I mean, nobody does this. Nobody sues Hollywood in that. And thought it would just blow over. But he stuck at it, and he ended up being very, very victorious. Yeah.
He got in a famous feud in Washington. Not everybody remembers Joe Alsop, but some of this crowd will. He was not afraid of going after the local aristocracy. So tell us about him and Joe Alsop.
Yeah, one of the things, the great things that I found that I didn't know about Art Buchwald, which I think is so different from a lot of the kind of comics and all that stuff. The Buchwald brand at one point was everywhere. I mean, not only did he have his column, but he had a radio show. He had a spot in 60 Minutes for a while. Every 4 years, he did spots at the national political conventions and such. But he also wrote a hit Broadway play called Sheep on the Runway, a satire, and political satire. It had a run of over 100 performances in New York. But what happened is that when the play started appearing in the traditional off-Broadway runs in Philadelphia and New Haven and so forth, that some rumors started coming back to Washington that the main character in this play, who was this crazy journalist, was based on Joseph Alsop. And Alsop at first kind of sloughed it off, but what happened is that people started coming up to him in the street and saying, hey, we heard about this play and all that. So he got upset, and he sent a lawyer up to New York to look at some performances, and the lawyer basically said, if you don't change this, we're going to sue you. And Art talked to Edward Bennett Williams to decide what to do, and Edward Bennett Williams, as you know, had equal chutzpah, basically said, let him sue you. Then you'll probably have a hit play, because you'll get all these headlines. So Buchwald refused to change things, and the play went on. Alsop never sued. As a matter of fact, a friend of his said basically, if you keep making a stink out of this thing, you're going to make the play a bigger hit than it already is. And so Alsop backed off.
So he's a funny man. He's a pretty happy, jolly guy, but maybe not completely.
Yes. that's another side of Art Buchwald that I didn't know anything about before I started working on this, and that was his periodic battles with depression, and a lot of it, as I understand it, kind of came from his difficult childhood and so forth. But he did have these periodic episodes of depression. But again, what I find wonderfully admirable about it was that even though he suffered with those, that he was always able to rebound and always able to bounce back and to continue on with his half-century career. So yes, he did have these difficult times and so forth, but again, it goes back to, childhood. I'll be funny. That'll make things better. That'll continue to make.
He also, he bonded with William Styron, his
Right.
Martha's Vineyard
And
neighbor,
Mike
and Mike Wallace,
Right.
and talked to. They sort of turned it around and
Yeah.
went public about their depression. And tell us about that.
Yeah, they went around the country and talking about their individual battles with depression, and they dubbed themselves the Blues Brothers, and the reason they did it was to try and help other people who had their own battles with depression, and either didn't want to talk about it or go public or whatever, and I remember seeing at the Library of Congress, the collection, some after Art Buchwald went public about his battles with depression stuff, letters that he just got from ordinary people saying, "Thank you so much for doing this. You've helped me," and such. So yes, the three of them went around and talked about it, and I'm sure it not only helped them, but it also helped a lot of other people.
He managed to. I think somebody said that he managed to have fun doing so many things. He even managed to have fun dying. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I might want to bring Joel and Tamara up for this. That he initially had these horrible medical issues. I won't go into all the details and so forth, but that for quite a while it looked as if he was going to die in a hospice care facility. And but even during that time, he with typical Buchwald chutzpah and good humor, he maintained a sense of humor. There's a great story that when Pierce O'Donnell visited him once at the hospice, Art said to him, "Did you have any trouble parking?" And Pierce O'Donnell said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I did." And Art said to him, "Dying's easy, parking's impossible." And the other great line that I just love was that when he did an interview, he became this celebrity talking about his experiences and his illnesses and survival and so forth. But he told this New York Times reporter when it was near the end, he said that when he died, he wanted his ashes to be spread over every Trump property in New York City. And of course, that didn't happen. But anyway, it just shows you a sense of that even when it was dark, he could maintain this.
Donald Trump. So he was aware of Donald Trump back in the day.
Yeah.
And how would he have handled Donald Trump today?
I think he'd be. I think he'd sharpen his satirical pen up, maybe a notch or so, and I think he'd give him a run for his money. And the other thing too, I think, I was thinking about this recently, is that of course Twitter was not in existence when Art Buchwald was still alive, but I think if he were alive today, he'd be all over Twitter. But I also think that with his quick-wittedness, I mean, he had an astounding quick-wittedness, and back in his days they were called Buchwald's buckshots because they were just boom. And I think if he were alive today, I think he could hold his own in an all-out Twitter war with anybody. And I think with a lot of the colorful material that we have with kind of our bizarre state of politics and so forth, that he'd have a field day. But also going back to the point that I made too, is that he'd see, things are pretty uptight now. So, I'll keep my satirical pen pretty sharp, but I got to make people laugh too.
Let's take some questions. Anybody? I think you need to come up to the mic to do it. Don't be shy.
I'll ask a question. You've talked about the extraordinary access that you had to a treasure trove of material that had over 100,000 pieces in it. How did you sort through it? And who was the you of this project, as you have been for others in helping you with the research?
Oh, thanks. That's, well, actually, a little bit of a story about that is that when a couple months before the pandemic lockdown happened, several months before, I found out that the Art Buchwald papers were just about to open at the Library of Congress, and so I found out that it's a treasure trove. It's one of the richest collections I've ever come across in terms of my maybe 30 plus years of research and so forth, just because of the scope of everything it covers, but particularly the correspondence, the extraordinary correspondence, much of which is published in Funny Business for the very first time. So what happened is that I thought, okay, maybe there's something here. So I talked to Barbara Baer, who's the historian in charge of processing the collection, and she contacted Joel and Tamara, and the four of us had a luncheon, and we talked about the possibility of doing a book. And they, from the moment, couldn't have been greater, nicer, and more supportive in terms of undertaking this really, really wonderful, wonderful endeavor. So at the same time, I mentioned the collection to our mutual friend, Jon Meacham, not only the presidential historian, but he's also a senior editor at Random House. He saw the potential of it, and he mentioned the idea to Kate Medina at Random House and Noah Shapiro, her assistant editor, and so forth. And they both thought, yes, this is a great idea. So thought, great, this is great. So around that time is when the serious talk started coming out about the lockdown. And I knew at that point, if we go through a lockdown, this collection's going to be closed. So I started shuttling back and forth, getting copies of everything that I thought would be, particularly the correspondence and interviews and stuff like that, thinking that at that point, I don't know if you remember, but I remember thinking at that point, if we had a lockdown, it was going to be for maybe 2 to 3 months.
Right.
So funny, I mean, ridiculous to think back. So I thought, well, if I can, shuttling back and forth, if I can get my hands on all this great stuff during the 2 to 3 month lockdown, I can really get started with the book. Lo and behold, a year and a half happens. So fortunately, in that shuttling, I had really gotten for what I needed for the book, the really rich archival material, plus the interviews and so forth. Plus, I was able to do online with newspaper.com, I was able to go back and get copies of interviews or commencement speeches or whatever, or other things that Art Buchwald had done to feather in that, or to get columns or whatever that I couldn't get elsewhere. And then the third thing I was able to do from home, again, thanks to Tamara and Joel, was that they were able to set up interviews that I could do from home. Not only did I have many chats with them, but Tamara set up an interview with Rose Styron, William Styron's wife. I spent a lot of time talking to Pierce O'Donnell about the Paramount case. And Kathy Crary, who was a longtime assistant to Art Buchwald, she was very, very generous with spending time. And she was very helpful in this chapter I do in the book called Buchwald at Large, which is a day in the life of, and she was helpful in filling in some things and heading me off and that. So with all of that, I was able to over the next year and a half of the pandemic, able to get a manuscript put together that I felt good, and then handed it in. And fortunately, you know, if I hadn't done that initial, I'd still be working on the book, and that. So it was one of those things where just you know, getting out there and just doing it, and that.
I should say to those of you who don't know it, nobody does archives better than Mike Hill. It's partly because he's got the patience and the eye for it, but also he's good at getting along with archivists. Archivists sometimes love papers so much they don't want anybody to see them, and Mike has a gift at finding the stuff, being patient, and he was able to put it to his own use, and you can really see it. I should, you know, Mike sent this manuscript around to various people, and it's amazing. You know, blurbs are a debased currency. Usually it's your friends. That's the way I do it. But these are real blurbs from Dave Barry, Seth Meyers, Carl Heiss, and these people have no relationship to Mike whatsoever, who read this thing and went, oh my God, is this funny and warm and interesting? Because Mike is the right guy for Buchwald because of the warmth. One thing that really comes through in this book is in a hard world, the warmth of both Buchwald, but that's Mike.
Thank you. I guess we can end there.
We got both.
Yes, John.
Did the American Jewish experience have any relevance for Art Buchwald?
Well, if I understand is that he did. I remember reading in his memoir that when he was in the Marine Corps that he did have some difficulties because he was Jewish, and that any time that he saw any kind of discrimination or anybody, you know, taunting him or going after him, all that stuff, he always just came back and fought. And you know, he describes at one point, you know, sometimes I was so bloodied and crying, but I felt that if I didn't stand up, that it was going to be all over, that it would never end. So I think that you know, sensitivity to it, but again, going back to the point of determination, and that he was never going to back down. He just wasn't. He just wasn't afraid of anybody.
He is an unlikely Marine. If you just look at him in World War II, there he is on some godforsaken atoll, yeah. And the fellows are giving him a hard time, and he does not back down.
Yeah.
Please.
So, I was my name's Michael Newman. I was Art's physician.
Yes, Michael, Dr. Newman. Yes.
And he was such an important person for many people here this afternoon. A few things, and you probably know this, and Tamara and Joel. Where did Art's depression come from? His mother was depressed. He never met his mother. His mother was in a mental institution and delivered Art. And what he told people was that his mother died in childbirth. And that was one issue. At the same time, as you know, Art had a difficult life in many ways, going in and out of different homes, including, he was very proud to be a member of the Jewish Orphans of America. And there are a lot of people here in Washington who had a similar, were also JOA. And he liked to connect with them. But when he started crossing himself, his father said, it's enough. He was in, I think, a Lutheran home or some home, and his father said, it's enough. And so that was an important part. And then the story of how he joined the Marines, 17 years old, and his just, what was he going to do, and finds this guy sitting on the street. So he tried to enlist, and they said, no, you're too young, you need your father. So he goes, finds some wino sitting on a curb, and says, will you sign this paper for $5 or whatever it was? He said, sure. So he gets a paper signed, he goes back, and that's how he joined the Marines.
Typical resourcefulness.
Typical. And I think his girlfriend's name was Francie. That was something like that. There was another person. in the Marines on that atoll, they had some kind of newsletter or paper, and Art wrote it and was starting writing funny things about the war. He knew what it was to be an underdog, and Art was one of the most caring people you would ever encounter here in Washington. And he'd read about incidents that happened in the newspaper, and he would send letters to them. He and Irma Bombeck were very close and good friends.
There's a great exchange between Bombeck and Buchwald in the book. A lot of that.
Yeah.
actually.
And Landers, and who's the short little Jewish woman about making love and yeah, Ruth Westheimer, you know, and it's such a character. But he cared about people. He knew what it was to be hurt, and he never wanted to hurt anyone, even in his columns and humor. But at the same time, there were people he detested. Roy Cohn. He detested what was happening
Bullies.
to the country, bullies and so forth. And he stood up for those kinds of things. At the end of his life, there's something called Publishers Clearinghouse, and you get a notification from Publishers Clearinghouse that you've won, and you get, you know, I don't know, $100,000 every week or something like that. And he sent out a group of letters saying, you've got this reward for Publishers Clearinghouse, and you've been chosen to speak at my funeral. You know, and it was really something. We all got together and talked about that, and at the hospice, which on Upton Street at that time, as you entered, it had engraved in stone, "Home for the Incurables." Yeah. That's what it said. So he liked that, and then the hospice movement benefited enormously from having Buchwald there, because it was an attraction. And you had visiting dignitaries. Ethel would come at least twice a week. She sent her priest, who I forget his name now, but one time he'd give him he said, "Father, do you have a prayer for me?" And he gives him the Irish prayer, "May the wind always be." He said, "Father, can't you do better than that?" You know. So he was a caring man. He loved people, very loyal, and his humor was a way in which he could make all of us feel better. He was a therapist in that sense, therapist for the country, someone who we really need today. So,
Thank you. That was
Thank you, Dr. Newell. Thank you.
wonderful.
Very nice.
Wonderful testimonial. Anybody else?
I have one more question.
Yeah.
My father, who is a friend of ours, told me something, and I want you to tell me if it's really true. My father told me that Art gave a graduation speech that was just, "We've given you a perfect world, don't mess it up," and that was the entire speech.
I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me.
so he was much involved with USC.
Yes, yes, he was very proud of that. Yeah, and the Marine Corps. He was very proud of being a member of the Marine Corps. Yeah, exactly.
Anybody else? Well, come. Mike will sign some books for you, and Joel and Tamara are around, and
Yep.
Happy to take any questions.
Yes,
So
thank you so much.
thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.